Amelia had always known the land would shape her fate, but nothing in her past could have prepared her for the day the wind changed and the world she knew began to unravel. It was July of 1883, and the Wyoming Territory was a vast, unforgiving canvas of dry hills and endless sky. The stagecoach rattled along a rutted track, each jolt a sharp reminder of the life she had left behind. She was a woman of 23, with brown hair pulled back so tightly her scalp ached, and a jaw that held a stubborn pride. Her hands, though small, were already showing the signs of a struggle she was still fighting. The journey had been long, each mile a silent testament to her resolve. The other passengers seemed to exist in a world separate from her own, cocooned in their anxieties. One, a man with a grim expression, stared blankly out the window, his silence a heavy weight. The other two, a pair of elderly women, whispered prayers under their breath, their rosary beads clicking softly. But it was the fourth passenger who held Amelia's attention, a woman named Eleanor Vance, dressed in a silk traveling suit that seemed utterly out of place in this dusty land. She carried herself with an air of cold, calculated superiority. Amelia had caught her appraising glance more than once, a look that seemed to see not a person, but a history written in the frayed edges of Amelia's simple dress. A chilling thought, a fear she had buried deep, surfaced. What if the past wasn't just left behind? What if it had followed her? Eleanor's presence felt like a constant, quiet threat, a shadow of the world Amelia had fled. The midday sun beat down relentlessly, baking the dusty plain until the air shimmered and danced. Amelia gazed out the small, grimy window, seeing nothing for miles but sagebrush in the distant, low-slung mountains. Her chest felt tight, a familiar knot of anxiety and determination. She had lost everything to a man who had promised her a new life, a new home, and had left her with only the clothes on her back and a few hard-earned dollars for this one-way ticket. She was not a crier, not anymore. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. Every dollar she had scraped together had gone into this journey. This singular chance to be someone else. Somewhere else. The thought of starting a new life was a fragile hope, a tiny candle in the immense darkness of her fear. A sudden, sharp crack split the air, followed by a violent lurch. The stagecoach tilted sharply to one side, its momentum carrying it into a shallow ditch with a grinding, sickening thud. Dust erupted around them in a choking cloud. Amelia was thrown forward, catching herself with her hands braced against the seat in front of her. The horses screamed, their frantic whinnies cutting through the sudden silence. Inside, the other passengers, the elderly women and the taciturn man, huddled together in quiet fear. Even Eleanor Vance, for all her composure, let out a sharp, indrawn breath. The world outside had proven its indifference to social status. Amelia was the first to move. She pushed the door open, the creaking protest of the wood a small sound in the immense stillness, and climbed out into the hot, heavy air. She brushed the dirt from her simple skirt, her movements calm and deliberate. The driver was a blur of frantic action, shouting at the panicked horses and cursing the broken wheel. It was a clean break, a splintered spoke splayed out like broken bones. The sun glinted off a discarded metal rim. Amelia knew, instinctively, that this was not a quick fix. She was stranded, with nothing but open country between her and the promise of a fresh start in a town called Silver Creek. She felt a surge of cold dread, a wave of despair threatening to wash over her. It was as if the land itself was conspiring to keep her from her destination. A voice from behind her, deep and as steady as the horizon, broke through her thoughts. "You all right?" She turned quickly, her hand twitching towards the small, sharp knife she kept tucked into her boot. She had learned to be ready for trouble, but the man standing there didn't look like it. He was a cowboy, probably in his early 30s, with a lean, strong build. His rifle was slung loosely over his shoulder, and a worn hat, stained with sweat and sun, was pulled low, casting a shadow over his face. Dust clung to his vest and the lines of his shirt, and the way he stood quiet, patient, unhurried, calmed a part of her she hadn't realized was frayed. His eyes, the color of smoke after a campfire has died, met hers without judgment. He wasn't like the men she had known back east, full of flashy promises and empty words. This man was all substance, a quiet force of nature. "I'm fine," she said, her voice clear and without a tremor. "You headed to Silver Creek." He nodded once. A subtle, solid motion. "Name's Caleb. I was headed back to my place. Saw your wheel snap." He glanced at the stagecoach, his gaze assessing. "That's not getting fixed before nightfall. Not without a proper set of tools." "I figured that much," she said, folding her arms across her chest, a half smile, faint and quick. Touched the corners of his mouth before it was gone. "You're walking, then?" he asked. "I was planning on it," she replied, her chin lifting. "I meant to start a job at the boarding house." "You won't make it before dark," he said. The statement a simple fact, not a warning. "And you don't want to be out here after dark?" Amelia's gaze swept over the vast, empty land. She'd told herself she was strong enough for anything, but a night alone out here was a different kind of challenge entirely. "I've slept in worse places." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "Still better to ride. My horse can carry two." Her mind immediately flashed back to the last man who had offered her help, the one who had taken everything. Her hand tightened unconsciously on the hilt of her knife. She had learned not to trust, had built walls of caution around her heart. But something about this man, the calm way he stood, the lack of a push or a demand, made her hesitate. She saw no pretense in his smoke-colored eyes. He was simply offering a choice, a way out of a bad situation. She looked at his face again, trying to find a lie, a hint of malice. There was none, only patience. "All right," she said, "finally. But I carry a knife." He stepped aside to let her pass, his lips tugging into that ghost of a smile again. "Good. Means you're smart." They rode in silence at first, the rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves against the hard, packed ground the only sound. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and crimson. Amelia sat stiffly behind him, her hands gripping the saddle horn so tightly her knuckles were white. She was acutely aware of his presence, the broadness of his shoulders, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories and fears, a silent battle between the woman she had been and the woman she was trying to become. The land around them was a mirror of her own isolation, but for the first time, she felt a small, strange sense of company in the quiet. The air, which had been so dry and hot, began to thicken. The vibrant colors of the sunset were quickly swallowed by a bruised, angry sky. A cool, damp wind, sharp with the scent of ozone, picked up, and the low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. "Looks like a storm's rolling in," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the wind. "A bad one. We won't make it to town dry." Amelia felt the first heavy drops of rain hit her face, a cold shock that quickly turned into a deluge. The wind howled, and the sky turned a menacing black. "We'll have to find shelter," she shouted over the noise. "My place is closer." Caleb replied. He spurred his horse into a canter, and they raced against the oncoming storm. The world around them a chaos of wind and rain. They reached his cabin just as the storm hit with full force, the rain coming down in sheets and the thunder a continuous, deafening roar. The cabin was a small, rough-timbered place, with a thin wisp of smoke rising from its chimney. He dismounted first, his movements practiced and efficient, and helped her down. She stepped inside behind him, the sudden warmth and quiet a shock to her system. It was a simple place, a single table, a wood stove, one bed. Her heart thudded in her chest, a drum of nervous apprehension. "I'll sleep on the floor," Caleb said, as if reading her thoughts, his voice low and calm. The simple statement diffused the tension instantly. He was not a threat, he was a refuge. She said nothing, just walked to the stove and held her hands out to the warmth, letting the heat seep into her chilled fingers. Caleb hung up his gun, then reached into a cabinet. "Dried meat, beans, coffee," he said, as if listing his entire worldly possessions. "Not much else." "I've had worse," she said, the words coming out as a genuine, quiet admission. He fixed a quick meal, handing her a tin plate. They sat across the room from each other, the only sounds the clink of their forks against the plates and the fury of the storm outside. The meal was simple, but it was the most comforting thing she had eaten in weeks. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked, her voice soft, barely audible over a roll of thunder. He took a slow drink of coffee, his face quiet, unreadable. "Not in years. What keeps a person steady in one place?" he asked, returning the question. "I'm not sure," Amelia admitted. "Maybe I just got tired of running." The words, once spoken, hung in the air between them, a quiet, vulnerable truth. He nodded slowly. "You still feel like you're running?" "No," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. "Not since I rode out here with you." They finished their meal in silence, a quiet understanding settling between them that transcended words. Later, as the storm began to recede, Caleb pulled a small, worn tin from his coat. Inside were a few coins, a broken button, and a folded scrap of paper. "This was my brother's," he said, handing her the paper. "He wrote it before he got sick. I never showed it to anyone." Amelia unfolded the paper carefully. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "Buy land, build a house with windows that open. Don't die alone." It was a simple list, a list of a man's quiet hopes. She handed it back, her eyes meeting his. "He just didn't want to go without anyone knowing who he'd been." Caleb explained, his voice thick with a mixture of sadness and love. "I think about that, too," Amelia said, and for the first time, she shared a piece of her heart with this stranger. "Not dying, but being forgotten." He looked at her then, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I won't forget you," he said. "Not ever." The words hung in the air. Not a promise, but a simple, unshakable truth. Amelia felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time, as the last of the storm clouds rolled away, leaving a clear, star-dusted sky. She knew she had found something on this road to Silver Creek that she hadn't even known she was looking for. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The air was crisp, smelling of wet earth and sage, and the sun shone bright and clear. The stagecoach was still a distant speck, but Amelia was no longer stranded. She and Caleb rode together to Silver Creek, the journey now feeling less like an escape and more like an arrival. The town was a collection of rough-hewn buildings huddled together against the vastness of the prairie. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and the boarding house, a two-story structure with a porch that wrapped around its front, stood as a testament to human perseverance. Amelia felt a flicker of hope, a fragile new sensation. She was here, a blank slate in a new town, with no one who knew her past. Caleb dismounted in front of the boarding house, his movements easy and fluid. "This is it," he said. And for a moment he seemed hesitant, as if the parting was more difficult than he had expected. "The lady inside, Ms. Margaret, she's a good person. Don't let her gruffness fool you." Amelia nodded, her own throat tight. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she felt a profound gratitude. "Thank you, Caleb, for everything." He simply touched the brim of his hat in a silent farewell before turning his horse and riding back the way they had come, disappearing into the distance as if he had been a figment of the storm. Amelia walked inside the boarding house, where she was met with the stern but kind face of Ms. Margaret, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and a gaze that seemed to miss nothing. After a brief but thorough conversation, Amelia was given a room and a list of chores. The work was hard scrubbing floors, washing laundry, cooking for the boarders, but it was honest. Each task completed was a small victory, a brick laid in the foundation of her new life. She found a quiet rhythm in the work, a meditative quality to the repetitive tasks. She was proving her worth not to anyone else, but to herself. Her days were long, but her nights were peaceful. She would sit on the porch after dinner, watching the stars blaze in the black sky, and think about Caleb. She hadn't seen him since that morning, but she felt his presence in the quiet moments, in the strength she drew from his memory. He had not offered grand promises, only a moment of quiet refuge and a truth she hadn't known she needed. He hadn't told her she could start over. He had simply given her the space to do so. Her quiet peace was short-lived. A few days into her new job, a man named Marcus began to frequent the boarding house. Unlike Caleb's quiet masculinity, Marcus was loud and boisterous, a flashy man who wore a silver-tipped belt and a hat that seemed too new for this town. He would smile at her, a confident, predatory smile, and make comments that Amelia instinctively recoiled from. "A pretty thing like you shouldn't be working so hard," he would say, leaning against the counter. "I could give you a much easier life." Amelia would simply turn her back and continue her work, her movements a silent but firm rejection. She had met men like Marcus before, men who saw her not as a person but as a prize, a possession to be won. He was a painful echo of her past, a reminder of the kind of man she had fled. His persistence was a slow, creeping poison, making her new refuge feel less secure. One evening, as she swept the porch, he approached her again. "I'll be going to the saloon tonight," he said, his voice low and insistent. "Thought you might want to join me. I've got a lot of friends in town. They could make things easier for you." "I have work to do," Amelia said. Without looking at him, her heart pounded in her chest. He reached out and gently touched her arm, his fingers feeling like a brand. "Just for a drink," he coaxed. Amelia's eyes flashed with a steely coldness. She took a step back, her hand once again moving to her side, where the phantom hilt of her knife felt more real than ever. "I said no. Mr. Marcus." Her voice was a low, dangerous whisper, a sound he had not expected. He backed away, his arrogant smile replaced by a look of surprised anger. That night, lying in her small bed, Amelia felt the walls of her hard-won peace begin to crack. The past she had tried so hard to outrun was not just a memory, it was a shadow that seemed to follow her everywhere. But she was no longer alone in this fight. She closed her eyes and, for the first time, she saw Caleb's quiet, steady face in her mind's eye, and she knew, with a certainty that calmed her trembling heart, that she would not run again. Weeks passed, and Marcus's harassment grew more subtle, more insidious. He no longer approached Amelia directly. Instead, he began to discreetly cause trouble at the boarding house. One morning, as Amelia went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, she discovered the hand pump was broken. A critical part of its mechanism was cracked, rendering it useless. This was a serious problem. A lack of water would cripple all of the boarding house's operations. Ms. Margaret, her face a mask of furious frustration, sent for the town's blacksmith. But he refused, citing a vague busyness. It seemed the entire town was turning their backs on them. Partly due to the malicious rumors Marcus had sown, Amelia felt a surge of helplessness. She was used to fending for herself, but this problem was beyond her capabilities. Her heart grew heavy. Marcus had won, at least in this small battle. She stared at the broken pump, a sense of defeat rising within her. Then an image surfaced in her mind, Caleb's steady hands, his strong, capable fingers. Without hesitation, she decided she would find him, even if it meant leaving the safety of the town to venture into the wild. She borrowed a horse from Miss Margaret and rode along the same path she had taken with Caleb. With every mile, she felt the tension building, but also a strange determination. Finally, she reached his cabin. It stood there, simple and sturdy, just like the man himself. Caleb was mending a fence outside. He looked up when he heard her approach, a rare flash of surprise crossing his smoke-colored eyes. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice as calm as ever. Amelia dismounted, taking a deep breath. "Our water pump broke. No one in town will help us fix it." He listened in silence, then gave a single nod. "I'll take a look," he said simply. He led her horse into the corral, and a little while later, they were riding back to Silver Creek together, this time on a road not marked by the tumult of a storm, but by the quiet of a new, budding trust. Caleb's arrival at the boarding house was enough to diffuse the tense atmosphere. He quickly inspected the broken pump, his eyes moving over the crack with a practiced eye. "The crack isn't deep," he said. "It can be fixed." Amelia watched him work, his fingers moving with incredible skill and precision. He wasn't a blacksmith, but his abilities seemed no less capable. He carefully took an old piece of metal, cut, filed, and welded it perfectly over the crack. Anyone watching could see that this was not the work of a simple ranch hand. It was the work of a master craftsman, a true artisan. As he worked, Amelia noticed a small hammer in his toolkit. The handle was finely carved, with a small etching of a galloping horse. She remembered the story about Caleb's brother, and the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. "You used to be a woodworker, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft. Caleb stopped, his smoke-colored eyes meeting hers without a hint of evasion. "I was," he said, his voice lowering with sadness. "It was my father's trade. He taught me and my brother. He was much better than me." He handed her a small piece of wood he had been carving. Simple but beautiful. "He carved this for me, before he got sick." Amelia held the piece of wood, her fingers tracing its smooth surface. "He asked you to buy land, build a house with open windows, and not die alone," she said, recalling the words Caleb had shared with her in the storm. Caleb nodded, his eyes gazing into the endless prairie. "He wanted me to live a meaningful life," he said. "But after he died, I gave up the trade. I couldn't bring myself to touch wood anymore. It felt like every time I did, I could see him." Amelia placed her hand over his. A simple but warm gesture. "He wouldn't have wanted you to give up the trade," she said, her voice filled with understanding. "He would want you to do what you love. He would want you to live the life you promised him." Caleb looked at her, and in his eyes, Amelia saw a shift. It was no longer the gaze of loneliness or pain, but of a quiet stillness, a dawning acceptance. Amelia didn't try to heal his wound. She was simply there, listening and understanding. Her presence, and her acceptance of his painful stories, had begun to change him. Together, they finished mending the pump. The water flowed again, clear and cool. The town could function once more. Marcus, though furious, could do nothing but retreat. Caleb's presence and Amelia's resilience made him realize she was not the weak woman he thought she was. In the days that followed, Caleb came to the boarding house more often. He didn't just help with broken things, he brought small, carefully carved pieces of wood. He said they were for decorating the boarding house, but Amelia knew it was his way of mending his own old wounds. She felt a deep connection, a bond that couldn't be put into words. She had run from a painful past, only to find a man who was willing to share the burden of his own past with her. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the stars, Caleb took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused from work, but it was incredibly warm and steady. "Amelia," he said, his voice low, "I wish my brother could see this place. He would have liked it very much, and he would have liked you." Amelia said nothing. She just squeezed his hand tightly. She knew that she had found the peace she had been searching for. She had found a man, calm and strong, not just to protect her, but to face life's challenges with her. And she also knew that she had found a home, a place she could call her own, right beside him. The quiet understanding that had settled between them in the aftermath of the broken pump grew into something more profound. Amelia and Caleb spent their evenings together on the porch, or walking the dusty streets of Silver Creek as the sun set. They didn't talk much, but their silence was no longer born of cautious observation. It was a comfortable, shared space where words were unnecessary. They communicated through small gestures, a gentle hand on her back as he guided her across a crowded street. The way he would bring her a cup of coffee exactly as she liked it. The look in his eyes that promised safety and quiet strength. He was a rock in the shifting sands of her new life. A constant presence that made the town feel less vast and lonely. She had never known such a peaceful intimacy, a connection built on shared pain and unspoken hopes. One warm afternoon, Caleb surprised her. He arrived at the boarding house not on his usual horse, but with a sturdy brown mare in tow. "Come with me," he said, his voice holding a note of quiet excitement she had rarely heard. He led her to the edge of town and then onto a trail that snaked its way up a gentle rise. Away from the bustle of the saloon and the general store, the air grew thinner, cleaner, and the scent of sage was stronger here. They crested the hill, and below them stretched a vast, open expanse of prairie, framed by the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains. A small, clear stream cut through the center of the valley, and a lone cottonwood tree stood tall on the bank, its leaves shimmering in the afternoon breeze. "This is it," he said, sweeping a hand out to encompass the land. "The land. The place where I was going to build." He didn't have to say "for us." The words hung in the air between them, a silent promise. "My brother wanted me to build a house with windows that open. I've thought about it every day." Amelia's heart swelled. She saw not just the empty land, but the beginnings of a life. A home built of honest timber and strong foundations. She saw a future where she could finally rest, where the walls would be built not to keep people out, but to hold a life of peace within. This was his offering, a fragile hope given shape, and a direct answer to her past. She had fled a man who had promised her a house of cards, but here, in this quiet valley, was a man offering her a house built of stone and wood, on a foundation of trust. This newfound happiness, however, was a bright light in a world of shadows, and it drew the attention of those who preferred the dark. Marcus, humiliated by Amelia's resilience and Caleb's intervention, had been festering in the back rooms of the saloon. He couldn't defeat Caleb in a fair fight, and he couldn't charm Amelia. So he turned to his only remaining weapon, his mouth. He began to whisper, to hint, to fabricate. "That boarding house girl," he'd say to anyone who would listen. "She's not what she seems. Came from back east in a hurry. You know, seems like a woman on the run." The rumors were insidious, and they spread through the small town like a sickness. The friendly nods she had received from the townsfolk became wary glances. The polite small talk turned into quiet whispers as she passed. Amelia felt the air grow cold around her. The hard-won peace she had found was being chipped away, brick, by a poison she couldn't see or fight. She tried to ignore it, to hold on to the quiet life she and Caleb were building. But the weight of the town's judgment was a heavy burden, a constant reminder of the past she had tried to bury. She would find a basket of laundry left on the porch, a chore she had already finished. Ms. Margaret, though kind, would give her a look of pity that Amelia found harder to bear than outright anger. The world, it seemed, would never let her escape her history. The feeling of being an outcast, of being judged and found wanting, was a familiar and painful ache in her chest. She began to wonder if the ghosts of her past were truly inescapable. The tipping point came on a cool, crisp morning. Amelia was sweeping the porch, a chore that had once been a source of quiet satisfaction but now felt like an empty ritual. A rider came into town, not with the usual dust and worn clothes of a ranch hand, but with a city coat, a fine horse, and a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He dismounted in front of the saloon, his movements sharp and deliberate. He wasn't a man of the West, he was a snake in the sagebrush. As he took off his hat, revealing a slick of hair and a sneering mouth, Amelia's blood ran cold. The broom fell from her numb fingers. Clattering to the wooden planks of the porch, it was him, John Carter, the man who had taken everything from her, the man she had run 1,000 miles to escape. He saw her then, his eyes locking onto hers. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He walked towards her with the same predatory confidence that had once charmed her, and had then been her undoing. "Amelia," he said, his voice a silky whisper that was more frightening than a shout. "I knew I'd find you." The past wasn't just a memory anymore, it was a physical threat. Standing right in front of her, fear, cold and absolute, gripped her heart, turning her limbs to ice. She felt the urge to run, to bolt from the porch and disappear into the prairie, to hide from this man who had come to collect the debt she didn't owe. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she instinctively took a step back, her hand fumbling for the small, sharp knife she still kept tucked into her boot. She had faced down Marcus's words. But this was a different kind of evil. This was a man who had not just hurt her, but had stolen her dignity and her hope. He was a symbol of all the shame she had carried, a living, breathing testament to her biggest mistake. John Carter's presence was not just a threat to her, it was a threat to the fragile future she was building with Caleb, a future he didn't even know existed. That night, she couldn't sleep. The moon cast long, ghostly shadows on the walls of her small room. She felt trapped, a hunted animal with nowhere to go. The urge to run was overwhelming, a siren song promising an end to the fear. But then she thought of Caleb's quiet strength, of his hands carving wood, of the empty land with the lone cottonwood tree. She thought of the home they were going to build. To run now would be to abandon all of it. To let John Carter and the past he represented win once and for all. It would be to give up on the man who had shown her kindness, who had given her a place to belong. She realized that running was a choice she could no longer make. Her past was a monster, but running from it had made her a victim. This time, she would not be a victim. She would be a survivor. She found Caleb at his cabin early the next morning. The sun barely a sliver on the horizon. The moment he saw her face, he knew something was terribly wrong. She told him everything. She didn't hold back, confessing the whole story of John Carter, the promises, the betrayal, the shame. She spoke of her fear, of the terror that had followed her for months. She told him that the man from her past was in Silver Creek, and that he was a threat to everything they were building. She expected a look of disgust or fear, but there was none. His eyes remained steady, his face a mask of calm determination. He didn't flinch, didn't judge, he just listened. When she was finished, he simply stood up and walked to his forge. He picked up a piece of iron, his hands moving with a purpose she had only seen when he was mending her pump. "We'll face him," he said, his voice low and firm, a sound of unshakable resolve. Together. His words were a balm to her trembling heart. He wasn't offering to fight for her, he was offering to stand with her. And in that moment, Amelia knew, with a certainty that calmed her trembling soul, that she had found not just a home, but a partner. The challenge was not just a threat, it was a test of their new beginning, and she knew she was no longer alone in this fight. Amelia's words hung in the still air of Caleb's cabin, a painful truth brought into the light. He had listened, a quiet, immovable presence, and in his silence, he had given her more strength than she had ever known. His resolve was a mirror of her own dawning courage. She had faced the choice to run or to fight, and with his hand in hers. The answer was clear. The past would not chase her any longer. She would turn and meet it head-on. They spent the rest of the morning in a quiet, focused preparation. Caleb didn't speak of strategies or violence, but of resolve. He helped her plan what she would say. Her words not of anger or vengeance, but of honest truth. He was her anchor, holding her steady as she prepared to walk into the coming storm. The next day, as the sun climbed higher, the tension in Silver Creek was a living thing. It coiled in the dust of the streets and hung in the air of the general store, where whispers fell silent as Amelia walked past. John Carter had not been idle. His presence alone was a threat, but he had taken it a step further. He had sought out Marcus, and the two of them, a snake and a viper, had begun to poison the well of the town's opinion. They spun tales of a past far more sordid than the truth, painting Amelia not as a victim, but as a criminal. She ran from a city with money she stole. Marcus would tell anyone who would listen, his voice low and conspiratorial. And she left a trail of broken men behind her. Caleb heard these rumors, but they did not touch him. He would simply look at the men talking, and their words would die on their lips. His calm was not a lack of concern, but a deep, unshakable certainty in the woman he had come to know. He was a silent sentinel, his presence alone a refutation of the lies. But for Amelia, the words were like tiny cuts, each one a reminder of the shame she had tried so hard to outrun. She felt the old, familiar fear begin to creep back into her heart, a cold finger tracing the outlines of her past. She would find herself hesitating before leaving the boarding house, her mind racing with what people might be saying about her. Was it worth it? To face this public humiliation, was it better to simply pack her bags and disappear again, a ghost in the vast, unforgiving West? One evening, as they sat on the porch, Amelia confessed her renewed doubts to Caleb. "Maybe this is a mistake," she whispered, her voice fragile. "Maybe I should just go. You've done enough for me." Her hands trembled in her lap. Caleb didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took her hands, his rough, calloused fingers a solid warmth against her cold skin. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her that she was brave. He simply held her, his grip firm and steady. In that quiet act, he was saying everything. He was telling her that she was not alone, that her past didn't define her, and that he would stand with her, no matter what. In his silence, she found her voice. In his stillness, she found her courage. She took a deep breath, and the trembling in her hands began to subside. The confrontation would happen in the heart of Silver Creek, in the town square, a dusty, open space where the town's small population gathered for gossip and business. Amelia knew that to face John Carter in public was to expose her past to everyone, but she also knew it was the only way to truly reclaim her future. The whispers and rumors had already poisoned the water. The only antidote was the unvarnished truth. The sun was at its zenith when they walked into town, a brilliant, unforgiving light that left no place for shadows to hide. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a palpable hum of anticipation that had been building since John Carter's arrival. People saw them coming, Amelia, her face set with a newfound strength. And Caleb, his usual stoicism now a shield of unwavering support. John Carter was in the saloon, leaning against the bar with a glass of whiskey, a picture of arrogant confidence. He saw Amelia and Caleb enter the square, and a sneer twisted his lips. He pushed himself off the bar and walked out into the dusty street, the tips of his shiny boots kicking up small clouds of dirt. The townspeople, sensing the inevitable clash, began to gather, forming a silent semicircle around the two men and Amelia. John Carter was the first to speak, his voice dripping with condescending mockery. "Look what we have here. A little stray kitten found herself a protector," he said, his eyes flicking from Amelia to Caleb. "Don't you know, these country folk don't take kindly to a woman with a checkered past?" Amelia's heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. But she held her ground. She looked not at John Carter, but at the faces of the townspeople, the wary, judgmental expressions that had caused her so much pain. And then she began to speak. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady. Cutting through the silence of the square, she told them everything. She spoke of the man she had met, a charismatic stranger who had promised her a new life in the city. She spoke of his betrayal, of how he had stolen her father's savings, leaving her with nothing but a worthless deed and a broken heart. She spoke of the shame that had made her run, of the fear that had haunted her every step of the way. She didn't spare herself. She confessed her naivety, her foolish trust, her shame. She stood there, a woman exposed and in her vulnerability. She found her greatest strength. The crowd listened in stunned silence. John Carter's smug expression slowly faded, replaced by a look of panicked fury. He tried to interrupt, to shout her down, but Amelia didn't let him. She simply raised her voice slightly and continued, her gaze fixed on the faces in the crowd. "He came here not to find me, but to finish what he started," she said, her voice ringing with the finality of truth. "He thought I was a broken thing, a woman who would run and hide forever, but I'm not. This town, this life, it has made me stronger." A gasp rippled through the crowd as she revealed her knife, not brandishing it as a threat, but simply holding it in her hand, a symbol of her resolve. As Amelia finished, a profound silence fell over the town square. All eyes were on John Carter, no longer a smooth city man, but a cornered animal. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, seeing not judgment, but a new, quiet solidarity. He looked at Caleb, who stood just behind Amelia, his hands at his sides, his presence a silent promise of force if necessary. And he saw in Amelia's eyes not fear, but an unshakable strength. He knew he was beaten, with a final, impotent sneer. He turned on his heel and walked back to his horse. He mounted up, gave the town one last hateful look, and rode out. The sound of his horse's hooves echoing a retreat into the vast, empty prairie. The shadow from her past was gone. The crowd broke its silence, not with applause, but with a soft murmur of relief. Miss Margaret walked up to Amelia, her gruff face softened with tears, and gave her a tight embrace. The townsfolk, one by one, began to offer quiet words of comfort and apology. Amelia looked at Caleb, and a soft smile touched her lips. His eyes, usually so guarded, were now open and filled with a deep, quiet pride. He hadn't fought for her honor. He had trusted her to fight for herself, and he had simply stood by her side. He had offered her not a rescue, but a partnership. And in that moment, Amelia knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she had finally found her home, a place where she was seen not for her past, but for the strong woman she was now, standing tall in the bright, unforgiving sun of Silver Creek. The storm had passed, and the truth had set her free. The dust settled slowly in the town square, but the profound silence that followed John Carter's departure lingered much longer. The air was no longer thick with tension, but with a palpable sense of release, as if a great, dark cloud had finally passed. The townspeople, who had moments ago been a single, wary audience, now moved forward as individuals. Their faces transformed from judgment to a quiet, humbled understanding. Ms. Margaret was the first to reach Amelia, her hands shaking as she pulled the young woman into a fierce embrace. Tears streamed down the older woman's face, a silent apology for the doubt she had harbored, for the pity Amelia had found so difficult to bear. Others followed suit, offering mumbled words of comfort and validation, a hand on her arm, a nod of respect, a few whispered words of welcome. For the first time since she had arrived in Silver Creek, Amelia felt truly seen, not as a woman with a past to be judged, but as a person who had fought and won. Caleb stood a few feet back, his posture as still and unwavering as ever, watching the scene unfold with a deep, silent pride. He knew this moment belonged to her, a victory she had earned with her own courage and truth. He had been her shield, her anchor, but she had been the one to face the storm. When the crowd finally dispersed, leaving the square to the long shadows of the afternoon, Caleb walked to her side. He didn't speak, but simply offered his hand. She took it, and the warmth of his calloused fingers was a grounding force, a promise of a future built on this very moment of earned peace. They walked back to the boarding house in a comfortable, shared silence, their hands clasped, a symbol of their new, unshakable partnership. The ghosts of the past were no longer following her. She had turned to face them, and they had fled. The following weeks were a period of quiet, deep healing. The town of Silver Creek had opened its heart to Amelia, and in that newfound acceptance, she was able to truly begin to let go of the shame that had been her constant companion. She no longer walked with her head down or hesitated before speaking. The townsfolk now greeted her with genuine smiles, and the polite small talk had become conversations born of true friendship. Ms. Margaret, in particular, had become a fierce ally, her gruff exterior now a protective shell around a soft, loving heart. She would bring Amelia fresh-baked bread, or a basket of flowers from her garden. Small gestures that said more than any words ever could. The boarding house, once a temporary refuge, now felt like a true home, a place of safety and warmth. But it was Caleb who was her North Star. Their bond had been forged in the crucible of her fear and his quiet strength, and it had emerged stronger than steel. One sunny morning, he came to her with the blueprints for the house, the same ones she had glimpsed once before. "Are you ready?" he asked, his eyes holding a world of unspoken questions and promises. Amelia looked at the drawings, at the simple, honest lines of the home they would build together. She thought of the empty land with the lone cottonwood tree, a place of beauty and possibility, and for the first time, she didn't feel a trace of fear. She saw not the ghost of her past, but the beginning of her future. She smiled, a radiant, wholehearted expression that he had never seen before. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul. "I'm ready." They began the construction a few days later. It was a project of immense scale, a testament to their shared resolve. Caleb, with his hands and his knowledge of the earth and wood, was a master craftsman. He would fell trees from the nearby stand, his axe a rhythmic heartbeat in the forest, and shape the raw timber with a quiet precision. Amelia was his apprentice, but she was far from a passive observer. She learned to measure, to saw, to hammer nails until her hands were sore and blistered. She worked tirelessly, her body aching at the end of each long day, but a deep sense of purpose filled her. Every nail she drove, every plank she sawed, was an act of creation, a defiant rejection of the destruction and betrayal of her past. She was not just building a house, she was building a new life, a new identity. One plank at a time. The house rose from the ground slowly, a skeleton of wood that would soon become their home. The seasons turned as they worked. The dry heat of summer gave way to the crisp, cool days of autumn, and the air filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. Caleb and Amelia fell into a natural rhythm, their movements synchronized by a shared goal and an unspoken love. He would pass her a nail, and she would drive it in without a word. She would hold a plank steady, and he would saw it with a perfect, practiced ease. In the evening, they would sit on the porch of the house that was not yet a home, watching the sun set over the prairie. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was a conversation of its own, a language of trust and shared effort. It was in these quiet moments that Amelia fully grasped the true meaning of Caleb's love. It wasn't in grand gestures or impassioned words, but in the steady, patient work of building a life, brick by brick, foundation by foundation. Together. He wasn't her rescuer, he was her partner. As winter approached, the house was finally finished. It stood on the rise overlooking the valley, a sturdy, honest structure with windows that opened. Just as Caleb's brother had wanted, it was a place of light and warmth, a bastion against the cold winds of the prairie. They moved in on a cold, gray morning, bringing with them only the few possessions they owned, but filling the empty rooms with a profound sense of hope and belonging. The air in the house smelled of fresh-cut wood and possibility. That evening, as snow began to fall, they stood by the fireplace, the flames casting a warm glow on their faces. Caleb turned to her, his face softer than she had ever seen it. "Amelia," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is our home." His words weren't a question, they were a simple statement of fact, a promise fulfilled. Amelia's heart swelled with a feeling so powerful, it brought tears to her eyes. This was the peace she had been searching for. A few weeks later, they were married. It was a simple ceremony, held in the town square where her past had been laid bare and her future had been won. Ms. Margaret, her eyes shining with joy, stood by as their witness. The town's pastor spoke a few kind words, and then Amelia and Caleb said their simple vows. Not in a grand church, but under the vast, open sky of the West. A sky that had once seemed so lonely, but now felt like an endless promise. It was not a wedding of opulence, but a celebration of resilience, of love forged in fire and quiet strength. There was no grand feast, just a small gathering in the boarding house, where the few friends they had made toasted their happiness with quiet respect. Amelia, dressed in a simple white dress, looked not at the people around her, but at Caleb, his face a picture of pure, unadulterated contentment. She was no longer a stranger, she was a wife, a partner, a homeowner, a member of this quiet community. She was home. Their new life was built on a foundation of work and love. They worked the land together, their hands and hearts joined in the effort. Caleb's forge, which had once been his sole companion, now had a partner in their life. Amelia, who had once fled from her past, now found her peace in the rhythm of the days, in the feel of the earth under her feet, in the steady, quiet presence of the man she loved. The house they had built was more than just a structure, it was a living, breathing testament to their journey, a sanctuary where she could finally let her guard down and simply be. She was no longer running, no longer hiding. She was living, and in that vast, empty prairie, with the man who had shown her that trust could be the strongest foundation of all. Amelia had found her forever. The story of her past was over, and the story of her future had just begun. Amelia's life, once a story of shadows and flight, had become a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The house on the rise, with its sturdy wooden frame and windows that opened to the vast prairie, was more than just a home. It was a living monument to a courage she hadn't known she possessed and a love she had never dared to dream of. The years had not been without their challenges, the harsh winters, the long, dry summers that tested the land, the quiet sorrows that come with any life, but they had faced each one not as individuals, but as an unbreakable unit. Their life together had unfolded with the slow, steady grace of the seasons, each day building upon the last, strengthening the foundation they had so deliberately laid. The quiet, solitary blacksmith of Silver Creek had become a father, and the man who had once found solace in the lonely rhythm of the forge now found a different kind of peace in the laughter of his children. They had two of them now, a son named Thomas, with his father's steady eyes and quiet strength, and a daughter, Clara, with Amelia's bright spirit and a wild, untamable love for the prairie winds. Their home was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of life, the clamor of a child's game, the soft melody of Amelia's humming as she worked, the low, steady voice of Caleb as he taught Thomas to whittle wood. Their days were a tapestry of simple, profound moments, breakfast at a table they had built with their own hands, evenings spent by the fireplace, the scent of pine and wood smoke a constant comfort against the cold, the forge, which had once been a symbol of Caleb's isolation, now stood as a testament to his steadfastness, its rhythmic clang echoing a life of purpose and honest work. It was a sound that no longer spoke of a man alone, but of a man at the heart of a home. For Amelia, the years had been a profound transformation. The nervous, guarded woman who had arrived in town with a past to hide was gone, replaced by a woman whose face held the gentle lines of hard-earned peace and deep-seated contentment. The shame she had carried had not simply faded with time. It had been actively washed away by a life built on truth and love. The fear was a distant memory, a faint echo of a storm that had long since passed. She had found her purpose not in running, but in staying, in rooting herself to this land and to this family. She had learned to bake bread, its warm, earthy scent a comforting presence in their home. She had planted a small garden, and the delicate flowers that bloomed each spring were a defiant burst of beauty against the vast, rugged landscape, a mirror of her own journey. Her hands, once sore from hammering nails, were now soft from the kneading of dough and the gentle touch of a mother, yet still strong enough to handle a hoe or a garden trowel. One crisp autumn morning, a season of gathering and preparing for the long winter, Amelia found herself walking through town, a basket of fresh-baked bread on her arm. She had not visited the boarding house in a long time, not because of any lingering pain, but because her life had been so full and so complete on the rise overlooking the valley. As she approached the familiar building, the scent of wood smoke from the chimney and the sight of Ms. Margaret's gnarled hands tending to her garden brought a gentle smile to her face. Everything was the same, and yet everything was different. The town was no longer a place of cautious refuge, but a place of belonging. The boarding house was no longer a temporary stop, but a cherished part of her past. She found Ms. Margaret on the porch, her face now more lined with age, but her eyes still holding that same fierce, protective glint. They didn't need many words. A simple embrace and a shared glance were enough. They had been through a fire together, a small, quiet battle that had forged their bond as strongly as Caleb's steel. As they spoke, Amelia's eyes fell upon a young woman sitting in the shadows of the porch. She was new to town. Amelia had seen her once or twice. A quiet, pale girl who kept to herself. But it was the look in the girl's eyes that stopped her heart. It was a look Amelia knew intimately, a look of fear, of watchfulness, of a person perpetually waiting for the next storm to hit. The girl clutched a small satchel to her chest, her shoulders hunched as if to ward off an invisible blow. She was Amelia, a lifetime ago. A wave of profound empathy washed over Amelia, an understanding that came not from a memory of pain, but from a place of deep healing. She saw not just the girl, but the journey ahead of her, the slow, difficult path from fear to peace. She saw the quiet strength that was already there, buried deep beneath the layers of shame and distrust. Without a word, Amelia excused herself from Ms. Margaret and walked to the porch railing. She placed the basket of fresh, warm bread on the ground, a silent offering of welcome. As she turned to leave, she caught the girl's eyes. Amelia offered her a gentle, knowing smile. A smile that said, "I see you, and you will be okay." It was a smile born not of pity, but of shared truth, a promise that the darkness did not have the final say. The girl's eyes, a mirror of Amelia's past, widened slightly in a silent, unspoken question. Amelia simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that carried all the weight of her own journey. And then she walked away, leaving the gift and the silent message of hope behind. As she made her way home, Amelia's heart felt lighter than it had in a long time, unburdened by the last vestige of her past. The ghosts were not gone entirely, she realized. They were a part of her story, a part of what had made her who she was. But they no longer haunted her. Instead, they had become a source of strength, a well of empathy from which she could now draw upon to help others. The vast prairie, which had once felt so lonely and intimidating, now felt like a familiar friend, a place of peace and endless possibility. She thought of her home on the rise, of the fire that would be lit, of the sound of her children's voices, of Caleb waiting for her. The final scenes of their life were a series of peaceful, enduring images. The sun, a burning disk of orange and gold, would dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the endless prairie. Inside their home, the light would be softer, warmer. Thomas and Clara would be playing by the fire, their small faces lit by the flickering flames, their laughter a music that filled the house. Caleb would be sitting in his chair, a piece of wood in his hands, his face a picture of serene contentment as he watched his family. And Amelia would be there, a quiet presence at the heart of it all, her hands busy with a mending needle or a book, her heart full with a peace she had earned with every difficult step, every courageous word, every plank of wood she had helped to build. The true meaning of home, she had learned, was not a place without storms, but a place built on a foundation strong enough to weather any storm, a place where, when the dust finally settles, you are not alone. You